Good afternoon. My name is John Nicholas. Welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park and welcome to the Winter Lecture Series. And this program is on the election of 1864. The presidential election of 1864 is probably the most contentious and most crucial election in this nation's history. It was an election whose outcome would determine the fate of two nations and include our future as well. And if you thought the presidential election of 2024 was wild, you ain't heard nothing yet. This was an election that took place in the midst of a civil war. It was an election where both major political parties were deeply divided between each other and amongst themselves. An election where a cabinet secretary secretly plotted to steal the party's nomination from the president. It was an election where the incumbent wasn't sure he would be renominated, and once nominated, didn't think he could win. It was an election where an ambitious candidate coveted power in his party's nomination, but once offered the nomination, he was reluctant to accept it. It was an election where a candidate was paired with a platform and a running mate he couldn't support. It was an election where both parties had second thoughts about their candidates and considered replacing them. But wait, there's more. As a bonus, there was a third party that nobody believed could win the election but might throw a wrench into the whole process. An election where a traitor couldn't get arrested no matter how hard he tried. It was an election that included a secret army that planned to free Confederate prisoners of war and march against their own cities. But wait, there's even more than that. It was an election with a diabolical scheme to assassinate the president using a biological weapon. An election with terrorist plots to burn cities in the North. It was an election where a 30-year-old feud between a president and a general would help the enemy of both. It was an election where nobody believed the incumbent, including the incumbent himself, could possibly win. Where one man would do everything in his power to save the country, even if it meant his own disgrace and defeat. An election of good luck and bad timing. An election where every citizen understood what was at stake, could see the big picture. And it was an election with the most brilliant politician in American history. All this and more as we look at the election of 1864. Now in 1864, the big question was, would there even be a presidential election at all? There had been a presidential election during the War of 1812. The nation was smaller back then, and communications were much slower. This was a civil war where a significant portion of the voter population would be far from home in Union armies spread all across the continent. Would they, who had the most to lose by the election's outcome, be disenfranchised? The question, whether or not there would be a presidential election, was answered by Lincoln himself in 1864. He said the election was a necessity. You cannot have a free government without elections. And if the rebellion can force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might be fairly claimed to have already conquered it and ruined us. Andrew Jackson had been the last two-term president. For the last 30 years, it had become an unofficial tradition that presidents only served a single 4-year term. Nothing legally blocked Abraham Lincoln from running again. And even if he did, would his party support him for another term? As far as the party went, Lincoln's fortunes went up and down with the tide of war. The fall of 1862 midterm elections had been hard on Lincoln's Republican Party, especially after the Battle of Antietam and the announcements of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't go over well with some parts of the country. In March 1863, Richard Dana, a Washington lawyer, would write, "The most striking thing is the absence of personal loyalty to the president. It does not exist. He has no admirers, no enthusiastic supporters. He has no friends." The question is, did Lincoln even want to run for a second term? Lincoln himself wasn't sure. The job was hard, exacted a toll on the man who held the office. Speaking to Francis Carpenter, who was painting a portrait of the president's cabinet at the time that the president announced his Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln said, "This war is eating my life out, and I have the strong impression I shall not live to see the end of it." At times, Lincoln has doubts about his own abilities. To Maine Senator Lot Morrill, he would say, "I don't know that God has created some one man great enough to comprehend the whole of this stupendous crisis and transaction from end to end, and endowed him with sufficient wisdom to manage and direct it. I confess, I do not fully understand and foresee it all. I am placed here where I am, obliged to the best of my poor ability to deal with it. And that being the case, I can only go just as fast as I can see how to go." But Lincoln is an ambitious man, and to a local man who happens to be in Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, he will say in 1864, "I confess that I do desire to be reelected. God knows I do not want the labor and responsibility of the office for another 4 years. But I have the common pride of humanity to wish that my past 4 years of administration be endorsed. And besides, I honestly believe that I can better serve the nation in its need and peril than any new man possibly can do." So Lincoln will be a candidate in 1864 if he wins his party's nomination, which he's doubtful of, and if he can win the presidency itself. And who are his opponents? Well, one of them is in his own cabinet. This man, Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of Treasury. Chase, one of Lincoln's rivals in 1860 for the Republican Party nomination. And Chase had been a former governor of Ohio. He was also the leader of the Radical Republicans, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But in 1860, he was considered too extreme by the standards of the party and was bypassed in favor of Lincoln. But Lincoln has selected Chase as his Secretary of Treasury, and Chase has worked miracles during the war to finance the war. But Chase always believed that he should have been president instead of Lincoln. He considered Lincoln too slow and cautious in his political decisions, believed that Lincoln was to be a poor administrator. He gave his secretaries too much leeway. In other words, he didn't micromanage them in managing their departments. Where Lincoln considered the views of all parties before making decisions, Chase thought the president was too influenced by others and not by him. Chase wanted to be president, and he thought 1864 was his year. Lincoln gave Chase a free hand in filling the Treasury Department in positions, and Chase stocked the department with his own political supporters who built a political machine within the State Department. The 19th century is considered improper to publicly campaign for the office of president. Party leaders selected the nominees while the candidates themselves worked behind closed doors to build support. It was also considered disloyal and unethical for a cabinet member to work to supplant the president. Yet here was Chase. And Chase worked secretly behind the scenes to build radical Republican support. In October of 1863, a very small campaign bio is published about Chase. Now, Chase claims, it's just a magazine series, and they just want to interview important people, and I happen to be the first one. He's lying about that because he's planned the whole thing. In December of 1863, Senator Samuel Pomeroy will form a secret committee for the election of Samuel Chase. Chase thinks of everything. He's even put his own portrait on the $1 bill, making it not only a bill of currency that every voter can carry around in his pocket, but it's also a miniature campaign poster that every voter can see when they open up their wallet. Chase lies to the president about the campaign bio. Chase thought he was operating in secret, but then there's a problem. Lincoln, everybody knows, Chase thinks nobody knows he's actually running for president, but everybody knows Chase is running president, including the president himself. And people come to Lincoln, his friends, and say, "Aren't you going to do something about Chase?" And Lincoln loved Shakespeare. He loved to read Shakespeare's plays, and he says, "No, I'm not worried about Chase because sooner or later he'll be hoisted by his own petard, and he will be soon." In March of 1864, Samuel Pomeroy will have a document published that denounced Lincoln as a complete failure and could not possibly be reelected. There's only one man of extraordinary ability and brilliance who could save the nation and restore the Union. But did such a man exist? Yes, he did. That great man's name was Salmon P. Chase. And what becomes known as Pomeroy Circular is distributed through 100 supporters. It's a secret document. Nobody's supposed to know about it, but it's leaked to the press. And suddenly, everybody knows that Chase is running for president. And he's greatly embarrassed by this. As I said, it's very disloyal to go behind your president's back to do these things. And the public reaction to the Pomeroy circular was so severe that Chase publicly withdrew his name as a candidate for the party's nomination. Now, Lincoln wasn't worried about Chase because he's got plans of his own. Simon Cameron had been the former Secretary of War, was also a Pennsylvania party boss, had been in politics for a long time, had worked with Andrew Jackson. And Cameron told Lincoln that when Jackson was running for a second term, he secretly sent out envoys to all the state legislatures to get their endorsements as president. So Lincoln will do the same thing. And Lincoln will even get the endorsement of Chase's home state, Ohio. But Chase, as I said, is a member of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is deeply divided in 1863. It's known as the Republican Party, but for this election it will be known as the National Union Party because it's not a coalition, and not just Republicans, it's a coalition of Republicans and war Democrats. Also, the party itself is divided between conservatives like Lincoln and radical Republicans like Chase. The radicals were the extreme portion of the party. These are the guys who are already in a hurry to get things done. As soon as the Civil War starts, they want emancipation to be proclaimed right away, and Lincoln knows that can't happen because the country won't go for it. But the radicals are always in a hurry, and there'll be a problem for Lincoln all throughout the campaign. If the Republican Party was divided, they were fortunate that the Democratic Party was so divided as to almost constitute two separate parties by itself: the War Democrats and the Peace Democrats. The War Democrats supported the war effort to restore the Union, but we are opposed to emancipation. Their motto was, the Constitution as it is, the Union as it was. The Peace Democrats were commonly known as Copperheads, for the poisonous snake. The Copperheads were opposed to the war completely, and they believed that Lincoln's policies were tyrannical. They wanted immediate armistice to the war, and they wanted an immediate end to the war. But beyond that, the Copperheads themselves were divided. Many wanted an armistice as a prelude to talks about reunion, with slavery still in place, while others were willing to accept complete Confederate independence. The Copperheads were considered traitors by the Republicans, by the War Democrats, and by much of the general public. Neither side of the Democratic Party really accepted the other, but separately, neither could accomplish anything without the support for the others. The Copperheads were led by this man, Clement Vallandigham, a former Ohio congressman. Vallandigham was the extreme Copperhead, and he went all throughout Ohio making speeches against the Lincoln administration, encouraging draft resistance and providing aid and comfort to the deserters and draft dodgers. Because Vallandigham is causing so many problems in Ohio, the general in command of the Department of Ohio, Ambrose Burnside, who you may have heard of before, orders Vallandigham arrested and held him without writ of the habeas corpus. Vallandigham was tried by a military tribunal and found guilty of sedition and sentenced to prison for the remainder of the war. When the Chicago Tribune printed articles and editorials criticizing the arrest, Burnside had the paper shut down. This caused a great deal of problems for the Lincoln administration because now Vallandigham is being turned into a martyr. And while Lincoln and his cabinet supported Burnside, because he is doing his job after all, they wanted this this problem to go away. So Lincoln comes up with a unique way of dealing with Vallandigham. He doesn't send him to prison. Lincoln banishes Vallandigham to the Confederacy. So a truce party with Vallandigham tied up marched to the Tennessee, actually the line in Tennessee between the Confederate and Union armies, and drop off Vallandigham. But the Confederates didn't want Vallandigham either, and so he's allowed to escape. But before he leaves Virginia, Vallandigham met with several Confederate congressmen and army officers who told the Ohioans that the South was not interested in reunion under any circumstances, would only accept independence as a condition for peace. Still committed to reunion, Vallandigham implied that if the reunion was impossible, Confederates would recognize Confederate independence. And Vallandigham escapes to Canada, and while in Canada, he meets with an old friend By late 1863, it was becoming apparent that the tide of war was beginning to turn against the Confederacy. Confederate government began looking for means beyond the battlefield that might turn the war in their favor. Who won the White House in 1864 could do just that. If a Democratic candidate won the election in 1864, it was almost certain that the new administration would sue for peace and grant independence to the southern states with slavery still intact. There were rumors of widespread dissatisfaction and war weariness in the Midwest, especially in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, and Kentucky. Confederates hoped to take advantage of this dissension and use it for its own purposes. In May of 1864, Jefferson Davis sent Jacob Thompson, a former U.S. Secretary of the Interior, a Mississippian and ardent secessionist with a shady reputation, to take charge of the Confederate secret operations in Canada. Thompson has several missions. One, free Confederate soldiers in the prisoner of war camps in the Midwest and return them to the Confederate Army. Two, create dissension in the North. Three, start a terror campaign by burning northern cities. And four, either killing or capturing President Lincoln. Thompson met with his old friend, Clement Vallandigham, who they knew each other before the war. Vallandigham told Thompson he was the supreme commander of a secret organization in the Midwest known as the Sons of Liberty, a militia group opposed to the war. Vallandigham said he had about 170,000 men spread across Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio. Vallandigham planned to cross the border in Canada into Michigan and then move down back to Ohio. He would begin speaking out against the war again with the expectation the Lincoln administration would arrest him. The announcement of his arrest in the newspapers would be the signal to the Sons of Liberty to spring into action to free Confederate prisoners of war, then march on state capitals in the Midwest to establish a Midwestern Confederacy. Vallandigham goes to Ohio, begins giving speeches, extremely violent rhetoric advocating soldiers to desert, people not to support the war, but then nothing happens. He can't get arrested. He amps up his rhetoric, makes even more violent demonstrations. Nothing happens. Lincoln's administration is now ignoring him. If Vallandigham was the traitor, they couldn't get arrested. With no arrest, there's no Midwest uprising. So now new plans are made to strike during the Democratic Convention in August of 1864. For the last 7 months, the Democratic government party has been courting George McClellan to serve as their candidate for president. McClellan had been dropped from his job as General-in-Chief of the Army and also the Commander of the Army of the Potomac in November of 1862. And McClellan, the War Department doesn't know what to do with him, so he's sent to New Jersey, to Trenton, New Jersey, where his wife lives, and they'll figure out what to do with him. They'll never call him up again. While he's in New Jersey, McClellan is beginning to write his official report for his actions for the last 2 years. But soon he's moving over to New York City. But he's a little bit too well known in New York City. People are following around everywhere. To escape from them, he moves up to northern New Jersey. But at the same time, he's having secret meetings all throughout the spring and summer of the Democratic Party. Even though he's trying to maintain a low profile, he cannot stay out of the public eye for long. In November of 1863, he endorses a candidate for the governor of Ohio. The candidate doesn't win, but it's Lincoln's first steps in returning to the public's eye. In June of 1864, McClellan is invited to West Point to deliver an oration for a monument dedication to the dead of the regular army who died in the war so far. In his speech, McClellan made it clear that he advocated for continuing the war until the Union was restored, something that would not have made the Peace Democrats happy, but there was also no mention of emancipation, something that did satisfy both sides of the party. In the meantime, Lincoln has his own plans for what's going to happen after the war. New Orleans falls to the Union Navy in 1862 in May, and when it falls, Lincoln begins to think about what's going to happen after the war is over. He begins to think about Reconstruction long before anybody else has. He comes up with a plan which has become known as the 10% plan. The plan is when a state has 10% of its voters take the oath of allegiance to the United States, that state can apply for admittance to the Union again. They will have to write a new constitution that abolishes slavery, but they can come back in the Union very quickly and very easily. Lincoln wants to do this because he's hoping this will encourage soldiers to desert from the Army and come back in the Union. There are some exceptions to it. Army officers above the rank of colonel, naval officers above the rank of lieutenant, and high Confederate officials would have to appeal for a full problem directly from the president to be reenfranchised, which is a thing that Lincoln thinks people will do. With the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in the summer and later in the fall at Chattanooga, people believe the war will end soon. At the same time, his party, especially the radical Republicans, are Lincoln at Lincoln's plan. At first they were fine with, but now they have other differences, Lincoln as well. In the meantime, by the end of 1863, U.S. Grant has become the most great hero of the war. Grant's unlikely rise from an obscure captain in a backwater department of southern Illinois and Missouri had led to a steady stream of victories from Fort Henry's and Donelson to Shiloh, Corinth, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, and made Grant the only Union general who constantly won battles and campaigns. And he won without constant demands on the president for troops or resources. Though they had never met, Lincoln instinctively liked Grant. He wanted to bring Grant east, but wondered if Grant had any political aspirations. Lincoln worried that if Grant got sucked into politics, winning the war would take second place. Lincoln needed Grant to win the war first. Speaking of Grant to a friend, the president said, if Grant takes Richmond, he can have the Confederacy. Both parties were looking at Grant as a possible candidate in 1864, but nobody had asked Grant himself what he wanted. In December of 1863, the chairman of the Democratic Party had written to Grant, asking the general if he could put his names forward at the convention in August in 1864 as a candidate for president. Grant wasn't interested and said to a friend, the question astonishes me. I do not know of anything I've ever said or done which would indicate that I could be a candidate for any office. Nothing would induce me to think of being a presidential candidate, particularly as long as there's a possibility of Mr. Lincoln being reelected. Later, Grant would say, I considered it important for the cause that he, Lincoln, should be reelected, as that the Army should be successful in the field. In March of 1864, Grant comes east. Congress has voted to restore the rank of lieutenant general. The first person to hold it since George Washington will be U.S. Grant. At Grant's promotion ceremony in Washington, D.C., after it was over, Grant would meet with the president to discuss strategy. Grant told him the war was simple. The real power of the Confederacy was its armies. Destroy the armies and you destroy the Confederacy. Grant planned to have his armies attacking all at the same time and never let up. Those Union forces that were not part of the main effort were to pin down Confederate troops in other areas, prevent them from reinforcing other parts of the Confederacies. Lincoln laughed and said, those not skinning can hold a leg. This is what the president had been trying to get his generals to do for 2 years. The president told Grant what he wanted all along was someone who would take responsibility and act, giving him the task of mobilizing all the power of the government to provide Grant with whatever assistance he needed. Grant would make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac because he knew the influence politicians had on the Army. He would begin planning his campaign for the summer of 1864. And what became known as the Overland Campaign would begin on May 4th, 1864. Lee's army was Grant's objective. Grant wanted to grind down the Confederate Army. His orders to George Meade and the Army of the Potomac were, wherever Lee will go, you will go. Because he expected to maintain the initiative throughout the entire battle, Grant expected his casualties to be high, but nobody else did. On May 4th, Grant will enter the wilderness in central Virginia. Lee will try and stop Grant in the wilderness. The fight will go on for 2 days with horrific casualties on both sides. At the end of the 2 days on May 7th, the Union armies lost 17,000 men. And Grant breaks off contact and makes a night march. The soldiers are marching along a road in columns, and they knew they were going to come to an intersection soon. When they reach the intersection, if they turn left, they're going to be going back to Fredericksburg, and this campaign will be another failure. But when they reach the road, Grant and Meade are there with their staffs, and all the men and General Grant are all pointing to the right, to the south. Men pull off their hats and wave them in silent cheers. They know the war is going to go on. There's no turning back now. Grant will strike again on May 10th at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And again with the same results, grinding Lee's army down. He'll write to Lincoln, I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Those words were the words the president wants to hear. While many criticized Grant, and Mary Todd Lincoln was one of them, she called Grant a butcher. Lincoln understood that in the long run, Grant was saving lives. Grant will turn again to the North Anna River with the same results. He'll march south to Cold Harbor, 10 miles east of Richmond. At Cold Harbor, he thinks he has the inside track. He thinks the Confederate Army is worn down. He thinks the door is open to the capital of the Confederacy. He launched an attack at Cold Harbor on June 3rd, 1863. The attack will last for about 4 hours, but really it's over in the first hour. Grant, depending on the accounts you'll read, will lose 4,000, 7,000 men in just 30 minutes. He'll write as the greatest disaster of the war, and he always regretted the attack. And for 10 days, the two armies will sit facing each other at Cold Harbor. Either side wanting to call a truce to bury the dead on the battlefield. But at the end of the 10 days, Grant's armies disappear. Grant is moving south again. He'll be the longest pontoon bridge of the war along the James River at a place called Flower Dew 100. Nice place if you ever get down there. He'll cross James River, and he's disappeared from Lee's front. Lee has no idea that Grant is now headed to Petersburg. 6 railroads ran into Petersburg. Capture Petersburg, and Richmond would starve, forcing Lee's army out in the open. Grant's army will attack across towards Petersburg, but their army is worn out, exhausted. The generals are tired and exhausted, and the attacks don't go off as planned. So the attacks are a failure, and Grant's army is now stalled in front of Petersburg and Richmond. At the same time, in northern Georgia, the 112,000 men of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's 3 armies, the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Ohio, began advancing south. Their target, 69,000 Confederate soldiers of the Confederate Joseph G. Johnson's Confederate Army of Tennessee. Grant's orders for Sherman to get into the interior and destroy Johnson, and then enter the interior of the state and destroy all the Confederate resources he can. Initially, Atlanta is not a resource. It's not an objective, but as Sherman moves farther to the south, it becomes clear that both sides, Atlanta was the key to the entire campaign. The city was a transportation hub with 4 railroads: the Georgia Railroad, the Atlanta and West Point Railroad, the Macon and Western Railroad, the Atlanta and Western Railroad that connected the city to Rutledge, Alabama, Augusta, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, Chattanooga, Charleston, Savannah, and Richmond. In addition, Atlanta's factories supplied small arms, ammunition, artillery, food, and clothing. Numerous buildings served as warehouses for the Confederate Army. Grant needed to take Atlanta, and the Confederacy needed to hold it. The problem was that Sherman needed to come to grips with Johnson's army, but Johnson wasn't playing Sherman's game. Realizing that he was both outnumbered and out-equipped by Sherman's forces, Joe Johnston understood the best way to win the war was to keep his army intact and delay and drag out the war as long as possible. Sherman hoped to draw Johnston out by outflanking him, but instead, instead of fighting, Johnston would fall back to the next position. This happened time and time again at Dalton, Resaca, Calhoun, Adairsville, Cashville, and Altoona. Johnson had bought the Confederacy 2.5 months with minimal casualties, but that was about to change. Meanwhile, as the summer approached, the political parties were convening to choose their candidate for the presidency. And the first party to convene wasn't really a party at all. These are people that are radical Republicans, but they're the extreme radical Republicans and extreme abolitionists who are leaving the party to form their own party of its own. They will meet in Cleveland, Ohio on May 31st. Their candidate will be this man, John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder of the West. Fremont had been an Army captain in the 1830s and 40s, who had become famous for mapping the Southwest territories of the United States. Fremont had run for president as the first Republican candidate in 1856, and Fremont made his home in St. Louis. He was also an abolitionist. And there was a lot of abolitionists, especially German abolitionists, that lived in St. Louis. But Fremont was also popular across the country as well. And these are people that are all opposed to Abraham Lincoln. Fremont would be made a general in 1861 of the Department of Missouri. And in August 1861, he'll issue the very first Emancipation Proclamation in the country, freeing slaves and Missouri rebels. There's a problem with that, though. He hadn't told the Lincoln administration he was going to do this. And in 1861, you had 3 border states, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, who are teetering about joining the Confederacy. If Fremont frees the slaves, the Confederate rebels, these states might join the Confederacy and the war will be lost. So Lincoln orders Fremont to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation that he's issued. Fremont refuses to do that, so Lincoln relieves him. Then he sends him east to command an army in southwest Virginia. He's faced against Stonewall Jackson, and generally if you're facing against Stonewall Jackson, you're John C. Fremont, you're going to lose, and he loses in a big way. So Fremont is relieved of command again. Lincoln puts another general ahead of him. Fremont is upset about this because he thought he was a big deal, and now he's no longer a big deal, so he will leave the army, and now he's a candidate for the presidency. The newspapers, with Chase out of the way, it appeared that Lincoln was going to be the Republican candidate for the president, and so all these disgruntled Republicans are leaving the party. They're meeting for this convention in Cleveland on May 31st to support Fremont as a third-party candidate. Manton Marble, editor of the New York World newspaper, called the convention a political flank movement and expected thousands of people to show up. New York World called it the People's Convention. And as I said, they expected thousands of supporters to show up, but they failed to show up. Only about 400 people actually showed up to this convention. The party, if you could call it that, was made up of gentlemen whose hair is brown and parted in the middle, long-haired political theorists with abstract ideas, short-haired women looking for a place at the table, and the usual assortment of cranks all united in their hatred of Lincoln. The party had no organization whatsoever. Author John C. Wall wrote, "There was no slate of delegates, no credentials were asked for. Anybody with nothing else to do could stray in, take a seat, get up, make a speech, cast a vote, and leave." Somehow, the party developed a platform and picked their candidate and a vice presidential candidate, and at the end of 12 hours, they are done. The only thing they need to do now is come up with a name for their party. And they'll come up with the name, the Radical Democracy Party. Very socialist sounding. The whole thing is over in just 12 hours, and that's it right there, and they will go home. Meanwhile, on June 7th, the Republican Party is meeting for their convention. Will Lincoln get reelected? Will he be nominated? The night before the convention, on June 6th, radical Republicans of the Grand Council of the Union League, who were opposed to Lincoln's nomination, met at Barnum City's hotel. One of Lincoln's secretaries, William Stoddard, was there to observe the proceedings and report back to the president. As Stoddard watched and listened, senators and congressmen, one after another, got up and made speeches denouncing Abraham Lincoln. Then came Senator James Lane from Kansas. Stoddard remembered that Lane was one of the most anti-Lincoln senators in the entire Senate. And Senator Lane is getting up to speak right now. Lane strides forward. He's a well-known orator and begins to speak. And Stoddard expects the worst. Instead, Lane begins tearing down every reason not to vote for Abraham Lincoln. Then Stoddard remembered, oh yeah, Lane had visited the White House several times a week before. I wonder what kind of deal was made. As he finishes speaking, Lane was met with thunderous cheers and applause. The last real opposition to Lincoln's nomination was gone. With Chase out of the way and the party united, Lincoln was nominated on the first ballot. The only real surprise of the convention was the nomination of the vice presidential candidate. The party usually selected the vice president, sometimes with the input from the president, sometimes not. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine had served as vice president of the United States for the previous 4 years. The New England states were firmly behind Abraham Lincoln, so they needed to attract more Democrats to the tickets. So Andrew Johnson, the wartime governor of Union-occupied Tennessee, was chosen as Lincoln's running mate. Nobody at the time thought that Johnson's selection was important. The nominees nominated, and the platform planked. Convention concluded at 4:30 in the afternoon of June 8th. But everybody wasn't happy. Manton Marble, the editor of the New York World, wrote, "The age of the statesman is gone. The age, the rail splitters and tailors of buffoons, bores, fanatics have succeeded. In a crisis of the most appalling magnitude, requiring statesmanship the highest order, the country is asked to consider the claims of two ignorant, boorish, third-rate backwoods lawyers to the highest stations of government. God save the Republic." And then from there, things are going well, but now things are starting to go bad. Initially, the radical Republican Party was behind Lincoln and his plans for Reconstruction. And plans for Reconstruction were already in effect in Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. But after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, many believed the end of the war was near. The radicals took a relook at Lincoln's plan and decided it wasn't to their liking, that changes needed to be made. A piece of legislation, known as the Wade-Davis Bill, sponsored by Senator Benjamin Wade and Congressman Henry Winter Davis of Maryland, slowly made its way through the House in the spring of 1864. Their bill was a bill for Reconstruction, and Reconstruction would be handled not by the president, but by Congress itself. Lincoln was merely to import their policies. Reconstruction was only to begin when the Confederate government had surrendered, not while the war was still going on. Anybody taking up arms that had supported Confederacy would be immediately disenfranchised. Anyone who held a slave would immediately be freed, and slavery would be banned in the state. All property, including lands, would be seized by the federal government and redistributed to former slaves and poor whites who had been forced in the Confederate Army. All former Confederate states would revert to the status of territories under administration of Congress. Only when 50% of the 1860 voters had taken the ironclad oath of allegiance to the United States could a state form a state legislature, write a new state constitution that must include an article abolishing slavery and then apply for readmission to the Union. The Wade-Davis bill was extremely vindictive. The radicals wanted to punish the South for the war and wanted to ensure the Southern planter class would never have any political influence in the South, the nation ever again. Congress is set to adjourn for the summer at noon on July 2nd. The bill was brought to the House on February 15, 1864, but it took until July 2nd for the House to approve the legislation on a 73-59 vote. The bill was quickly rushed to the Senate for their approval. If the bill wasn't approved before adjournment at noon, a new Congress would have to take up the matter in the next congressional session, and there would be no congressional plan for Reconstruction until the next year. Senate immediately brought the plan to the floor and voted on it with little debate. The bill passed on an 18-14 vote. As the Congress set to adjourn at noon, Lincoln had arrived at the Capitol. He was in a room signing last-minute legislation. The Republicans believed he would sign the Wade-Davis bill practically sight unseen. With only minutes to spare, the bill reached the table where Lincoln was sat. The president looked at the bill, which was much more complex and inflexible than his own plan. He realized that the radicals' plan to abolish slavery in the South without a constitutional amendment was illegal. Legally, for right now, only the president's own Emancipation Proclamation was the only document that could do that. Lincoln said the bill required much more examination before he would sign it. So Lincoln would do something very rare. He would issue a pocket veto, meaning he would not sign it, but might sign it at a future date. But at this point, the bill would have to go back before Congress and would have to wait until the next year. While all this is happening, for much of June, the war is stalled in Virginia and outside Atlanta as well. Union armies aren't going anywhere. And for much of June, Colonel George Sharp of the Army of the Potomac's Intelligence Service, the Bureau of Military Information reported that Lieutenant General Julius Early's Confederate Second Corps, with about 15,000 soldiers, had left Lee's army at Petersburg, has moved north down the Shenandoah Valley. Grant, having little knowledge of the excellent work Sharp had been doing with his bureau, ignored the reports. But on July 4th, Grant not only was getting information from Sharp, but also getting panic messages from the War Department. The Confederates had crossed Potomac River and turned towards Frederick, and now they're heading straight for the capital. On July 9th, Early's troops were slowed down by a small, inexperienced Union force in Monocacy Creek, which bought Grant 24 hours to pull the Union Sixth Corps out of the lines at Petersburg, put them on transports, and head them up the Potomac River to Washington. On July 12th, Early's corps was less than 5 miles from the White House, as they were probing Union fortifications that protected the city. President Lincoln had ridden out to Fort Stevens, where Walter Reed Army Hospital used to be, to watch the fight. Sitting on a parapet, mini balls were flying around the president, and a surgeon was wounded standing right next to him, and people were telling Lincoln to get down. And still he sits there watching the Confederates fire at the fort. Finally, a young Army captain would become a future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Not recognizing the tall man on the parapet, yelled, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot." Lincoln turned and responded, "Now that's the order I understand." He stepped down. Meanwhile, Early is looking through his binoculars at Fort Stevens. He saw that reinforcements were coming up. He noticed they weren't wearing new uniforms of inexperienced soldiers. They wore faded uniforms. They were veterans of the Union 6th Corps, and he could now see their colors as well. He realized he had arrived too late, so he didn't press his attacks. For another day of skirmishing outside of Washington, Early retreated back to Virginia. Lincoln, realizing that he has the opportunity to bag the whole lot of them, sends out orders to his generals, but nobody's in charge in Washington. Henry Halleck, the Army's chief of staff, refuses to take any responsibility, and so Early gets away, which upsets Lincoln even more. And in the meantime, as the wise said, the war has stalled. The initial attacks outside Petersburg have failed. More ambitious plan to take the city by exploding a mine on the Confederate defenses failed, leaving nothing but huge casualties. At the same time, both sides settled down for a siege. As far as those Union armies in the Shenandoah Valley, the Red River in Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast, and in Florida and South Carolina that were supposed to hold a leg while others were skinning, those campaigns had failed as well. The Union cause, all the military failures, high casualties, and Early's raid on Washington meant the war had stalled, and now new threats were beginning to emerge. The Democratic Party had planned to hold a convention in Chicago around the 4th of July. With failure after failure stacking up against the Republican Party, Democratic leaders decided to postpone the convention until late August, when they hoped things would be even worse for the Republicans. In the meantime, Atlanta had become the focal point of the war. But there's a problem. Jefferson Davis is dissatisfied with his general, Joe Johnston. Joe Johnston and Jefferson Davis have known each other for 30 years. They met at West Point. They've had a feud going on now for 30 years. These men hate each other left and right, and Davis believes Johnston is not the man to be leading the army. He needs a more aggressive general, and Johnston just wasn't it. So on July 18th, 1864, John Bell Hood assumes command of the Army of Tennessee. If Davis wanted an aggressive general, he got what he asked for. 2 days after taking command of his army, Hood ripped into Sherman's army at Peachtree Creek, Decatur, and Ezra Church, and suffered 18,000 casualties out of an army of 60,000. In 10 days, Hood lost more men than Johnson had lost in 10 weeks. By July, Atlanta had become the focal point of the war. Both sides had invested so much manpower and material into the campaign, the city became a symbol of resistance for the Confederacy, a symbol of determination for the Union. For Southerners, its defense assumed an importance greater than New Orleans, Vicksburg, or Chattanooga, and made it second only to Richmond in terms of morale, hopes, and the will of the Confederate people. They saw Hood's attacks as Confederate victories, not disasters. They overlooked and ignored the huge casualties. For Sherman, capture of Atlanta took on more importance than the destruction of Johnston's army. Both Sherman and Grant understood the political importance of Atlanta and began shifting more reinforcements to Sherman's armies. Sherman's armies, though, were supplied by a single-track railroad running 400 miles back to Louisville, Kentucky. It was vulnerable to Confederate cavalry raids led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Hunt Morgan, and Fighting Joe Wheeler. By late July, Sherman himself seemed stalled outside Atlanta with the supply line stretched for 400 miles. Nobody knew when or if Lincoln would take the city. A significant portion of Sherman's army was used to protect the railroad, and by late summer, though, that was becoming less of a problem because the U.S. Railroad Construction Corps, which was created during the war, was becoming so efficient at repairing the rail lines that damage could be repaired in a matter of days or even hours. Quick turnaround repairs meant that damage done by Confederate raids could no longer compensate the loss of men and horses, and Sherman now had more men in his armies. Both Hood's army and the Confederate Republican fitted to believe that Sherman's could not operate at the end of such a long supply line for much longer, and Sherman would eventually be forced to retreat. Northern public was beginning to turn Sherman's army. It was turning against Sherman's army as well. The New York Times reported the public's temporal fits of despondency, while a Wisconsin soldier wrote, "We make little progress towards Atlanta. It may be some time before we take the place." A high-ranking official, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, believed that both Grant and Sherman were on the eve of disaster. Meanwhile, at the end of August, the Democrats were preparing for the convention in Chicago. But in the meantime, there's one other problem that Lincoln has to deal with. This man, Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was the editor and publisher of the New York Tribune, the biggest selling newspaper in the entire country. Horace Greeley also liked to dabble in politics, although he would never attach his name to anything. And in 1864, in August, things are going from bad to worse. While Early was leaving Washington, Lincoln has to deal with Horace Greeley. Greeley has informed the president he has received word there are 2 Confederate ambassadors in Niagara Falls and Canada. Had instructions from President Jefferson Davis to negotiate a peace settlement if Lincoln would meet with them. Greeley urged Lincoln to speak with them to save our bleeding, bankrupt, and dying country. Now, both Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward thought it was a waste of time, but at the same time, they couldn't ignore it. So Greeley will go up. Greeley is appointed by Lincoln to meet with the peace commissioners. He thinks this will finally get rid of him. John Hay, Lincoln's secretary, is also sent with Greeley as well, and he carries a letter that is addressed to whom it may concern, to drop to the 2 men. Lincoln knew the only issues to negotiate were reunion and emancipation, neither of which Davis or the Confederate government would accept, either together or separately. The purpose of the letter was to get Jefferson Davis to acknowledge in writing the Confederacy would never accept reunion even with slavery intact. Meeting with the 2 envoys begins on July 18th. The mission is a complete disaster. Greeley discovers the envoys have no commission from Richmond to negotiate any peace whatsoever with them. So the whole episode is a huge failure and incredibly embarrassing to Horace Greeley. The episode will turn into a propaganda disaster for Abraham Lincoln. The 2 Confederates send an account of the meeting to the Associated Press. They mention the letter from Lincoln, but no mention is made of reunion, which the Confederate government would have rejected. The Confederates falsely claim the only issue preventing peace was that Lincoln would not abandon the Emancipation Proclamation as condition for any of the war. Democratic newspapers amplified and distorted the letter further, to whom it may concern, was only adding more fuel to the fire burning down Lincoln's election hopes. On July 17th, Lincoln tries to put the ball back in the courts with the Confederates by sending another commission of a Methodist minister and a journalist, James Gilmore, down to see Jefferson Davis in Richmond. The envoys are met with Davis, and his response to reunion was exactly what Lincoln expected. Davis will say, "We are fighting for independence, and that, or extermination, what we will have. You may emancipate every Negro in the Confederacy, but we will be free. We will govern ourselves. If we have to see every Confederate plantation sacked, every southern city in flames." Upon returning to the North, Gilmore published several accounts of the meeting. The New York Times commented that the meeting established that Jefferson Davis would listen to no one for peace patrol proposals, nothing to embrace reunion. And the efforts of those now being made by the Peace Party of the North to delude our people into believing that peace is now practicable without disunion, Davis's words, peculiar, timely, and valuable. At the same time Lincoln is dealing with this, there is now backlash for Lincoln not signing the Wade-Davis bill. Wade and Davis were furious at Lincoln's pocket veto, and in August, Henry Winter Davis wrote a manifesto savagely denouncing the president, calling the president a usurper and a dictator. Senator Wade took the document to Horace Greeley, who still hadn't recovered from his embarrassment at Niagara Falls, and told Greeley to publish it in the New York Tribune. The manifesto went off like a bomb. A Republican senator and Republican congressman were viciously attacking their own party's candidate for president just 3 months before the election. Many believe that the purpose of the manifesto was to force the party to reconvene and replace Lincoln with a new candidate. James Bennett, the New York Herald, wrote, "One thing must be self-evident to him, that under no circumstances can Abraham Lincoln be elected as the next president of the United States." Plans were being made to reconvene the Union Party in late September to replace Lincoln. But before that happened, Henry Lincoln and the party leadership planned to meet Lincoln at the White House in late August. At the same time, others in New York are trying to get Grant to run for president once again. And Grant will respond, "They can't do it. They can't compel me to do it. I consider it as important to the cause that Lincoln should be elected as the Army should be as successful in the field." To the Washington, New York politicians and newspaper editors, Lincoln was finished. Nobody thought Abraham Lincoln could win the election, even though there still wasn't a Democratic opponent to run against. About this point, in August of 1864, Lincoln met with a radical congressman and asked the congressman if he would be willing to go out on the campaign trail and speak for the president's election. The man replied, "No, sir. As things stand at present, I don't know what in God's name I could say as an honest man would help you at all." Abraham Lincoln is stunned by this response. He stops for a moment, and then he looks at the man, stares him directly in the eyes, and says, "You think I don't know that I'm going to be beaten? But I do know. Unless some great change takes place soon, I'll be beaten badly." Abraham Lincoln is at a crossroads. The Democrats and many of his own party wanted him to repudiate the Emancipation Proclamation. If he did that, not only would he lose the vote of the radical Republicans, he would have betrayed 130,000 black soldiers then serving in the Army. With no future to look to, they would desert, and who would blame them? Lincoln understood he could not win the war and restore the Union without them. At the same time, the public believed the war was solely being fought for the abolition of slavery. He would lose their vote as well. It didn't seem there was any way he could possibly win the election. During this time, July and August of 1864, to many people it appeared that Lincoln was suffering from what was known as melancholy. We would call it today as depression. Throughout his entire life, numerous observers reported that Abraham Lincoln seemed to suffer from periods of extreme sadness or depression. It was probably hereditary. Both parents seemed to have the same affliction. So did Lincoln's uncle, and so did his cousins. Lincoln's former law partner, William Herndon, wrote of Lincoln, his melancholy dripped from him as he walked. Henry Whitney, a young lawyer who knew Lincoln from his Springfield days, said, "No element of Lincoln's character was so marked, so obvious, and so ingrained as his mysterious, profound melancholy." In later years, Lincoln told friends that he saw the world as a hard and grim place, full of misery that made that way by the fates of God. But then, things turn around. Frederick Douglass had met Abraham Lincoln a year before in August of 1863. And Douglass had asked Lincoln to come to the White House to speak to him again in August of 1864. Douglass had been critical of the president, and he thinks that's why Lincoln wants to talk to him, but Lincoln doesn't want to talk to him about that at all. Lincoln comes to the White House on August 19th, almost a year later after Douglass had first seen the president, to meet with him privately to discuss several issues. When Douglass walked into Lincoln's office, he was shocked how much the war had aged the president since they had last met a year earlier. Lincoln told Douglass about the "To Whom It May Concern" letter and how it came back to haunt him. Newspapers were full of articles and editorials that there would soon be peace if only the president were to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation, which constitutionally was only valid as part of the president's wartime powers to deny Confederacy a source of labor. And Chief Justice Roger Taney's Supreme Court probably ruled that it was invalid once the hostilities ended. Lincoln always understood his primary mission was to restore the Union. He also understood that if slavery survived, that any peace settlement would only be temporary. He knew when he sent John Hay to deliver the letter to Greeley at Niagara Falls, the Confederate government would never agree to return to the Union with or without slavery. Many people in the North did not understand this and believed that slavery was the only issue preventing peace. For many Democrats and some Republicans, ending slavery was too high a price to pay for a war that had already cost thousands of lives. And many voters were beginning to turn against Lincoln. Until then, Douglass had not realized what tremendous pressure Lincoln had been under to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. The president told Lincoln he wouldn't win a re-election because he could not rescind the proclamation. Lincoln then changed the subject. He told Douglass that he was disappointed the Emancipation Proclamation had not had the effect he thought it would. It appeared that only 5% of enslaved people were leaving slavery and coming in the Union lines. Douglass told the president the slaves' owners had ways of keeping knowledge that the Union Army would set them free from the slaves. Lincoln asked Douglass if there was a possibility to form a corps of former slaves returned to the South to spread the word, lead their people to freedom. Douglass said he would talk to his friends and could see what would be done. As the two men were talking, the secretary came in and told the president that the governor of Connecticut was waiting to see him. Lincoln said to the secretary, "Tell the governor to wait. I need to talk to my friend Douglass a while longer." Douglas later told a friend he was stunned by Lincoln's remark, and he realized that Lincoln saw Douglas not as a black man, but as another human being who was just as important as another one was. For different reasons, the meeting with Douglas seemed to have a profound effect on both men. Part of the meeting, Douglas had been critical of the president's actions. He now saw the president was doing everything in his power to free his people at tremendous personal cost to himself. Lincoln had been suffering from depression, seems to have discovered a renewed sense of purpose. He would probably lose the election, he believed, but he would still be president. And as long as he was president, he would do everything in his power to win the war, at least ensure the war would have at least some favorable outcome for thousands still in bondage. The meeting still seemed to be on Lincoln's mind later in that meeting when he met with the governor of Wisconsin, a retired judge from Wisconsin. Both men later remarked that Lincoln seemed more positive, more upbeat than in previous meetings they had had with the president. As August inched to a close, Lincoln saw that his chances for re-election were fading. His advisors continued to tell him his chances were non-existent. Democrats had not even selected a candidate to run against Lincoln, yet his own parties were telling me it would take a miracle to win. Lincoln's party was planning to get someone else. And on August 23rd, Lincoln will meet with his cabinet for the weekly meeting. He'll bring before them a blank piece of paper, which will become known as the blind memorandum. It's a piece of paper with some writing underneath it, but the top has been folded over the writing. It's pasted in place. And Lincoln asked his cabinet to sign the piece of paper sight unseen, which they all do. Lincoln will not tell them what it says, but this is what it says. This morning, as for some days past, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured the election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. Abraham Lincoln. I've always looked at the blind memorandum as an act of desperation. But was it? After the meeting with Frederick Douglass, after the meeting with the governor of Wisconsin, after this, Lincoln sees this more as an act of determination. It'll go on the following week, because on August 24th, 2 days before the Democrats are going to meet in Chicago, Henry Raymond will come to the White House. And Raymond has proposed to send a peace commission to Richmond to talk to Jefferson Davis about peace, with no mention at all of emancipation. And Lincoln says, make short work, commission. He convinces Raymond that's not going to work. It'll be a sign of surrender. Lincoln's brought his big guns with him as well. Seward, Stanton, and his new Secretary of Treasury, William Fessenden, they all talk to Raymond, and Raymond himself is convinced that no commission will go to Richmond. And Raymond will go back to New York City, where he has his office. Raymond also has another job. He's also the editor and publisher of the New York Times. And 2 days later, on the day the Democrats will meet in Chicago, New York Times will publish an editorial that will say, Abraham Lincoln will win the election. In the meantime, the Confederates are going to try again. Jacob Thompson and his agents hoped the distraction of the Democratic Convention in Chicago would free Confederate prisoners in Chicago, and they can take advantage of that. But the convention drew so many delegates to the convention and so many people to Chicago, including the Sons of Liberty, that the hotels are packed. There's no way to get the word to the Sons of Liberty to attack Confederate prisoner war camps. So that plan goes down the drain. But there are still other plots Confederates were planning. There's a plot to burn New York City and Boston. And there's another plot even more diabolical. There's a plot to assassinate the President of the United States. One way to ensure that Lincoln would not be reelected was to eliminate the President himself. Dr. Luke Pryor, Blackburn, a doctor from Kentucky, had been studying yellow fever, and he volunteered his services to the British government in Bermuda to go there and help them with what he believed was a pandemic down there. And while he's there, he's collecting clothing from victims of yellow fever and packing them in trunks bound for northern cities. He's also collecting a lot of clothing from wealthy people who have died of yellow fever as well, including a lot of shirts. He'll pack them in a valise. The plan is for a Confederate agent to take the valise to the White House with a letter from an anonymous admirer who's going to give Abraham Lincoln a bunch of used shirts. And Blackburn believes that that these shirts are contaminated with yellow fever. Once Lincoln tries the shirt on, well, he doesn't even have to try it on. He'll just have to look at it. Lincoln will get yellow fever and die. Now, we all know the yellow fever is not spread by contagious diseases. It's spread by mosquitoes. But Dr. Blackburn didn't know this in 1864. The intent was clear. This was an assassination plot that fortunately failed. Meanwhile, on August 29th, the party leadership of the Democratic Party will hold a convention in Chicago. The convention had been planned for July 4th, but now with the failures of everything, it's been moved to August, and they are meeting. At the start of the convention, before the convention starts, Noah Brooks, a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, a reporter of the Sacramento Daily Union, would stop by the White House to say goodbye to the president and head to Chicago. Lincoln asked Brooks to write him 2 or 3 letters sending them news of the convention that probably wouldn't end up in the newspapers. Before leaving, the president told his friend that he must nominate a peace Democrat on a war platform, and if not that, a war Democrat on a peace platform. And I can't personally say that I care which one they do. Convention begins at noon on August 29th in a hall that would be packed with politicians, delegates, and spectators, a place called the Wigwam, a building built completely from wood, has no lighting inside. After beginning at noon, there are several speeches denouncing Abraham Lincoln, then the party gets down to business, forming contentious committees, organizations, and resolution committees. The Peace Democrats know that George McClellan be their candidate for the president, but they expect conditions from the War Democrats. Clement Vallandigham, who was a delegate to the convention, was named to the Resolutions Committee, meaning that a prominent Copperhead would have a voice in drafting the party's platform. The Resolutions Committee would deliver their platform the next day at 4 p.m. And it would say, after 4 years of war, to restore the Union, by the experiment of war, we demand that the immediate efforts be made for cessation of hostilities with a view to an ultimate convention of states or other peaceable means that to that end, at the earliest practicable moment, peace would be made and the Union would be restored. The author of the plank was Clement Vallandigham, who weeks earlier had been told by Confederate officials this would not happen. The War Democrats were so intent on getting McClellan nominated before darkness set in, they ignored the platform completely. Strangely, for a building of the size of the Wigwam, which held 1,500 people, it had no lighting, and light is coming dim and dimmer. Had they paid more attention to the war failure plan, the War Democrats might have voted differently. To no one's surprise, McClellan's name was put before the convention, and he's nominated, although there are several Peace Democrats that are also nominated as well. After several speeches, the Democrats denounced McClellan, but they know he's going to be nominated anyway. But now it's getting dark. It's too dark to see, and calls are made to adjourn to the next day. And so they will adjourn until 10 a.m. the next morning. The next morning, the ballots were ready to vote for McClellan. On the first ballot, McClellan received 174 votes, more than enough for the nomination. The presidential candidate had been selected. The party moved on to the vice presidential slot. The War Democrats had hoped to pair McClellan with another War Democrat, and said they got Congressman George Pendleton of Ohio, who's a hardcore Copperhead. They couldn't get somebody like Vallandigham. This guy is close enough. Surprising, there's no pushback from the War Democrats, and Pendleton is nominated by unanimous consent. With major issues decided, convention adjourns on August 31st and go home to wait McClellan's formal letter of acceptance. Meanwhile, McClellan is at his home, now in upstate New Jersey, and has been notified of the party's actions. The question was, how would he respond to the war failure plank? The war failure plank and his running mate had pulled the rug out from under McClellan's support to continue the war to restore the Union and leave the slavery intact. How could he run on such a platform that the war was a failure? Would he have to back out? Would he have to back in the soldiers in the field? 7 days passed after the Democratic Convention ended. McClellan remained silent, secluded in his mountaintop home in Orange, New Jersey. The party had nominated their candidate. The candidate didn't know how to respond to the platform, or rather to the second plank of the platform. From all over the country, letters and telegrams came in from friends, politicians, West Point classmates, and the regular army with contradictory advice. If he accepted the war failure plank, he would lose the soldier vote and many of the war Democrats. But if he refused the war failure plank, Blandingham would warn him he would lose 200,000 votes and half the party. Lincoln waited a week to decide how to respond. The country wanted to know what was taking McClellan so long to answer. When President Lincoln was asked what he thought was taking McClellan so long, he knew firsthand McClellan's habit of indecision and procrastination. And Lincoln said, "Oh, he's entrenching." During the week, McClellan wrote 6 drafts of the acceptance speech, trying to find some way to thread the needle through the offending plank. The letter finally went out over the telegraph wires on midnight at September 8th. Accepting the nomination, McClellan would not say the war was a failure. But he also didn't say it had been a success as well. He also said the Union must be restored. But there's no mention of slavery, cessation of hostilities, or how to restore the peace, or how to restore the Union. If the war wasn't a failure, why did it appear that the North was surrendering? And if the North surrendered, how would that lead to restoration of the Union? If the Confederacy wasn't surrendering, why would they agree to the restoration of the Union? What did any of this mean? The question now would be, how would the nation react to all of this? Meanwhile, 3 days after the end of the convention, word comes over the telegraph in Washington, D.C. that Atlanta has fallen. Sherman has taken Atlanta. This was the biggest deal of the entire war. On September 1st, when Hood's last supply line was cut, he realized he could no longer hold the city. He ordered the city evacuated, and all the military stores, warehouses, and rail cars would be destroyed. Explosions from 81 rail cars of ammunition were heard all night. One Confederate soldier wrote, "The great struggle is over. Atlanta is being incinerated." Next morning, Major General Henry Slocum, name might sound familiar, commander of the Union 20th Corps, moves into the city and is met by the mayor of Atlanta, who surrenders the city. Slocum wires Sherman and the War Department that Atlanta has fallen. At 10:30 on the night of September 2nd, Lincoln was at his usual spot, the War Department's telegraph office, when he receives the news. The official word will come from Sherman at 5:30 p.m. on September 4th, and it said, "So Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. The news was electric. As it spread to the North and the South, the Chicago Tribune announced, "Union men, the dark days are over. We see our way out. Thanks be to God, the Republic is saved." New York Times added at once, "The workshop, the granary, the storehouse, and the arsenal of the Confederacy were now all ours." The Charleston Courier told its readers, "The hope of receiving deliverance from our crushing blows had been abandoned. At the beginning of another season, we are admonished to prepare to pass through more months of blood and tears and suffering." The Atlantic Chronicle and Sentinel would write, "We have a great disaster." North Carolina wrote home to his father, "I'm afraid that the fall of Atlanta will secure Lincoln's reelection." Atlanta was the greatest victory of the war. After the embarrassment of Jubal Early's raid on Washington, Grant gave Major General Philip Sheridan command of the forces in Northern Virginia. Grant gave Sheridan 2 orders: pursue and destroy Jubal Early so it was no longer a threat. And once Early was out of the picture, Sheridan was put the valley to the torch, so that in Lincoln's words, crows flying over the valley would have to carry their own rations with them. 3 weeks after Atlanta, Sheridan defeats Early at Winchester and Fisher's Hill. And he's left for a meeting with Grant. He goes back to Winchester, and Early counterattacks. Launches an attack at Cedar Creek. Sheridan can hear the gunfire, races on his charger, Rienzi, 13 miles back to his army to see his army retreating. He rallies his army, leads in a counterattack, and destroys Sheridan's army. Sheridan's army probably reelected Lincoln. After the Union victories at Mobile Bay, Atlanta, and the Shenandoah, the war no longer looked like a failure. But the proof would be at the polls in November. George McClellan, as the Democratic government, was too much for the radical Republicans. They might have liked Lincoln, but they hated McClellan. With McClellan as the opposition, now Lincoln appeared to be the better choice. And much of the party began to fall in line behind President Lincoln, including Horace Greeley and Salmon P. Chase. Chase will travel by horse, by railroad, by steamship to Missouri, Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Indiana to campaign for Lincoln. The guy that wanted to replace him is very enthusiastic about Abraham Lincoln right now. So one last problem remained. That was Fremont, the Radical Democracy Party. Fremont had no chance of winning, but third-party candidates often derailed elections. Would Fremont put McClellan in the White House? Zachariah Chandler was a senator from Michigan who, though a radical, was friendly with Lincoln. Chandler took it upon himself to patch up the wounds in his party. The radicals had long hated the Blair family of Maryland and Missouri, and Francis Blair had been advisor to Lincoln, and so was his sons. Montgomery Blair was Postmaster General of the United States, and the radicals hated Blair. And so Chandler will go to Lincoln and ask Lincoln to ask Blair to resign. Blair himself several times had told Lincoln, anytime you need me to resign, I will do it for you. I will do it to save the Union cause. And so he will resign. And the Blair family would never blame Lincoln for this. Chandler will go to Fremont, and Fremont will drop out of the party. So travel back and forth to see all the radicals, including Benjamin Wade, Henry Davis, and tell them that Fremont is out. Now it's Lincoln or McClellan. Now the voters need to decide. Tuesday, Election Day, November 8th, 1864, is a dreary, raining day in Washington. Much of the city was deserted. Everybody had gone back home to their home states to vote. The White House is empty. Government workers and states who didn't have the absentee ballot were given a free furlough, 15-day furlough, and a free train ticket back to their home states to vote. In the Shenandoah Valley, President Wilbur Wisk, the 2nd Vermont, wrote, "Election day today is here. Today, thousands of bits of paper are falling to ballot boxes all over the country. It is a little thing and can be done very easily, but mighty consequences may hang on the result." Back at the White House, Tad Lincoln came running into his father's office to point out the window and show him that soldiers had set up a ballot box and were voting on the White House lawn. Lincoln and Tad went outside to watch, and when they concluded their voting, Lincoln went over to talk to the soldiers. He thanked them for once again taking part in an experiment in the nation's democracy. Then he told them that he was a temporary occupant of the White House behind them. But he was living proof that every father's son, no matter what their station they had in life, could grow up to live in the same house. At 7 p.m. that night, it was still raining as Lincoln tramped through the mud to the telegraph office of the War Department to wait for the election results. As they waited, much to the Secretary of War Stanton's disgust, Lincoln took out a thin yellow booklet from his coat, began reading aloud from the humorous political writings, Patrolling v. Nasby. Lincoln needed to relax, and so did everyone else. Election results began coming in around the country around midnight, and a dinner of fried oysters was brought out for everyone. At 1 a.m., it became apparent that Lincoln had won. Complete results would not be known until several days. Lincoln had won by a margin of 411,428 votes, or for a total of 2,213,665 votes to McClellan's 1,802,237 votes. Electoral count was a blowout, 212 to 21. McClellan only carried New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. And so November 18th, actually, no, step back a second here. On November 9th, or shortly thereafter, you'll heard the news that Abraham Lincoln has been reelected as the president, and you knew the war would go on until Union achieved victory and the nation was restored. What you didn't know yet is what would happen when it was all over. And what would it all mean? Journalists get the first crack at history, and it's often imperfect. But historians usually have to wait. They need time and perspective. They need primary sources that generally won't be available for decades after an event is over to truly understand the outcome of that event. So for us, what's happening today really won't be understood for at least 20 or 30 years. That's long after many of the occupants of the White House have left the stage, long after the point where many of us, myself included, will probably have shuffled off this mortal coil. The voters in 1864 couldn't see into the future. But they could see just far enough into the future. They could see just far enough that they knew how much their vote mattered. They could see just far enough They didn't have our perspective. But what we now know is that over 160 years ago, enough voters had made the right choice and found the one man who was truly great enough. I want to thank you for coming out here this afternoon. If you have any questions, stick around. But thank you very much for coming to Gettysburg. Thanks a lot.